So this is going to be the lecture on neurons in the brain. So this is chapter. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, why am I having to do biology? This is a psychology class, but really biological psychology is a huge area of psychology. Because of that, we're going to spend a fair amount of time in this class talking about biological psychology. It's starting out with neurons in the brain. Now, a lot of this can be really complicated, so feel free to go back and look over the different slides. Feel free to post on the Q&A board in Schoology if you want to. I also highly recommend reading the textbook, especially for those areas that you find challenging. And of course, if you have any questions about any of the material, feel free to come ask me. When we're looking at the brain, the cells in the brain can generally be divided into two different types of cells. We have glial cells and neurons. Glial cells are not talked about as much when we talk about the cells of the brain, but they're actually way more common. The glial cells work like the neuron's pit crew. So they provide nutrients, they provide myelin. Now we'll talk more about what myelin is later on. And they help to guide the connections between the neurons. So they actually help those neurons make connections with other neurons. Now, when we look at really complex brains, you would think that the more complex the brain is in terms of species differences, but also in terms of differences between humans, you would expect that the more complex the brain is, the more neurons there are. That's not actually true. We see that the number of neurons is pretty much the same for more and less complex brains. However, the number of glial cells increases dramatically with brain complexity, such that we saw when we looked at Albert Einstein's brain, he had roughly the same number of neurons as everybody else, but he had way more glial cells. Now, what this means is that his neurons were using a lot of energy. So think about a NASCAR pit crew. So NASCAR pit crew, there's only one driver, but there are tons of people working on that pit crew. And the more advanced level you get into, the more people you're going to have on your pit crew. And the same thing goes for complexity in thought. Next, we have neurons. Now, neurons are what you typically think of when you think about brain cells. Now, neurons can be a bit complicated, so I'm going to break it down into different parts of the neuron and then different ways that the neuron acts. So just like every other cell in your body, your neurons have a cell body, and so that's that part right here. And you can see here's the nucleus, and remember the nucleus is where DNA is going to be and things like that. Now, the cell body is the central structure of the neuron. But it is not what really communicates. So we get messages coming in from dendrites, and that's what these pieces up here are. These purple parts up here, these are all dendrites. And the messages come into the dendrites, and then they pass from other cells, and then they send those messages into the cell body. Then we have this long arm down here, and this is the axon. Now, the axon is the extension out of the cell body, and the messages travel down the axon in order to go to the next cell. So you can think of it as the cell body decides that it wants to send a message, and then the axon is its messenger of sort. That's how it gets to the next cell. On here, you can see these kind of yellowish spots. These are the myelin sheath. Now, myelin is a fatty tissue that's made up of glial cells. So you remember how I just talked about glial cells, how they provide myelin? Yep, so there's our myelin. Now, what myelin does is it insulates the axon. So if you think about your electronics, you think about your computer charger cord. It's actually wrapped up in a whole bunch of plastic and rubber and things like that. And what that does is it insulates it. This makes it so that the message, the electrical impulse, can travel more quickly down the cable. Now, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, neurons work on electrical impulses the same way. Now, if we just had a naked wire, there would be a really good chance of that message dying out quickly. And so by insulating it with the myelin sheath like this, we can make it travel more reliably and faster down this axon. Now, in the disease multiple sclerosis, what happens is that myelin sheath breaks down. And so the axon is no longer insulated. Now, what that means is those messages can't get from the cell body to the next cell. And this makes it so that you can't make connections, you lose muscle control, you lose the ability to sense things, so sense touch coming in and things like that. Now, in between here, this one's not in the textbook, but I wanted to talk about it because it's kind of important. These are the nodes of Ranvier. What these are is these are gaps in the myelin. So here's our myelin, and then the nodes of Ranvier are the gaps in between them, where it's not insulated. And you may think, why do we want any places where it's not insulated? That's because in these nodes, we're able to recharge. So you can think of it as going down the interstate, and if you just had to keep going down the interstate and there were no stops, your car would run out of gas. But instead, there are a whole bunch of exits that you can pull off on. And at those exits, you can stop and you can fill up with gas, and then you can keep on going down the road. And that's what the nodes of Ranvier do, is they allow us to recharge that signal. Finally, down here, we have the axon terminal, or the terminal branches of the axon. Terminal being the end, so it's the end of the axon. This is where this neuron that we've been talking about is going to meet up with the next neuron in the line. And so there are the dendrites to the next neuron. So it's going to connect, it's going to meet up with the dendrites from the next neuron. So the axon terminal from the previous neuron up here sent its axon all the way, and then it connected to this cell. And that's how we get the message it's coming in here. And then we send a message down, and then we send a message out down here at the axon terminal to the next cell. So those are the major structures of the neuron. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how the neuron works. Now, the neuron is kind of unusual compared to a lot of other cells in that it has what's called a resting potential. What this means is that they're not just kind of sitting there neutral. They actually have an electrical and chemical balance compared to the surroundings. And this balance is caused by the distribution of ions. So we have sodium ions outside, we have a whole bunch of potassium, or this K plus ions inside. And we see that we see positive and negatively charged ions both outside and inside. So we have positive sodium out here. We also have negative chloride out here. We have negative chloride out here. We have potassium. So this is our inside. We have potassium. We also have very negatively charged proteins. So we have those proteins in here. And those negatively charged proteins make it so that the inside of the cell, in where the cytoplasm is actually around negative 70 millivolts when we compare it to outside. So this is an electrical gradient. That means that the inside of the cell, so the inside over here, is negatively charged compared to the outside. We also see a chemical gradient. Now what this means is we have a whole lot more sodium outside and a whole lot more potassium inside. Now, if you remember back to physical science, you'll remember that we like to, that one of the properties of the universe is that we like to diffuse things. So if you have a whole lot of potassium on one side and a whole lot of sodium on the other side, those potassium ions want to get out and those sodium ions want to come in. But that's not how it is. So when we're sitting at this resting potential, this means that the neuron is not sending any messages. When we're sitting at that resting potential, The cell is selectively permeable. So what it's doing is it's letting potassium in and it's letting sodium out. That's not actually the direction that they want to go, but that's the only thing that will happen. So we talked about, you might be familiar with osmosis and selectively permeable membranes. That's what this is. And so because of that, we talk about this negative 70 millivolt resting potential. And that's important to know about because that's going to be important once we talk about the action potential. And speaking of the action potential, when we see those messages coming into the dendrites, remember the dendrites are the branches, those arms that come off of the cell body and receive messages. The messages that those dendrites receive are either going to be stop signals or go signals. Now, stop signals are also called inhibitory signals. Now, what they do is they take us from this negative 70 millivolts and they actually make us more negative. Go signals are excitatory. They make the cell less negative, so they make it more positive. Now, once we get enough of these go signals, so once we have enough other cells telling this one cell through the dendrites to go, then the cell meets what's called the threshold. So it's received enough positive signals, enough excitatory signals to move us from negative 70 to about negative 55. At that point, we have what's called an action potential. This is an electrical pulse that travels down the axon. So what this is it's like an electric shock. So it's a pulse of electricity or electrical charge that travels down that axon. And that's why we needed that insulation. Just like your power cord on your computer, it's an electrical charge. And so it travels down. And this is what's called an all or nothing response. You can't have a little bit of an action potential. You can't have a neuron fire just a little bit. It's either going to fire and send that electrical pulse, or it's not going to fire. Once it gets going down the cell, down the axon, it opens up some of these gates that are in the cell wall. And what this does is it lets potassium come in, and it lets sodium come in, and it lets potassium go out. And so we see, because a whole bunch of sodium comes in, you can see we used to have a whole lot of potassium in here and a whole lot of sodium out here, and now it's the opposite. And you can see when we look at this electrical signal, we're all the way up to positive 40 millivolts. So we had been at negative 70, and now we're all the way up at positive 40. Now this is called the action potential. And so it is the electrical pulse that starts in the cell body and travels down the axon. Here's a graph that shows what the action potential looks like, just looking at the voltage. So this is our negative 70 millivolts that we were sitting at. Now, if we received a couple of go signals, we might have a little bit of an increase, might have a bit more of an increase if we receive some more go signals. But it's not until we get enough go signals to hit that threshold that we have our action potential. And our action potential, what that does, if you remember here, it moves those sodium ions in. And what that does is it takes us from really negatively charged to really positively charged. And then we have to get back down to our resting state. Now, this may look to you like a cardiogram. So if you've ever looked at like a pulse reading, like in a hospital or something, that may be what this looks like. And that's because it's the same basic concept, because they're all electrical signals. But once the action potential has fired, You're all the way up here at your positive 40. But the cell can't go again. The neuron cannot fire again until it gets back to this resting state. And so we have this time when the cell is coming down, and then it actually overshoots a little bit, and then it comes back up to where it's supposed to be. And this time is called the refractory period. The refractory period is a time in which the cell cannot fire again, because it can't fire again until it gets back to this resting state. And so what that means is that you can't have a neuron that is constantly firing. It has to take a breather in between, and that's that refractory period. So the signal goes within one cell, within one neuron, with electrical pulses. But how do we actually communicate from neuron to neuron? That is not done by electricity and is actually done by chemical signals. So we have here neural communication. This is the communication between the neurons, and it takes place at what's called the synapse. So that's what this whole thing is. All of this is called the synapse. And this is where the terminal, the axon terminal, the end of the axon of neuron A, so this is the neuron A, this is the one that had our action potential that we were following, meets the dendrites of neuron B. So that's the second one over on the bottom here. And this is going to be what's called our postsynaptic neuron. Now you'll see that the cells don't actually touch. There's actually this gap. And this is called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft. So this whole picture is our synapse. Now neuron A, the one that we had our action potential, receives that electrical impulse. You can see that here with the lightning bolt. Receives the electrical signal coming down. Now when that happens, that stimulates the neuron to release this kind of bucket of chemicals called neurotransmitters. And then those neurotransmitters get released into the synaptic cleft, and then they go bind with the postsynaptic neuron. They bind with the receptor sites. So neurotransmitters are these little chemical messengers or molecules that are going to be used to send signals from one cell to another. Now, our neurotransmitters can be inhibitory or excitatory. So the signals that we send can be excitatory or inhibitory. So our neurotransmitters are these little diamond-shaped molecules, and these are released by the presynaptic neuron. So this is the presynaptic, and then this is our postsynaptic neuron. So the neurotransmitters get released from the presynaptic neuron, go and bind to a receptor site. This is a receptor site on the postsynaptic neuron. And it locks in there just like a lock and key. Now we talk about the job of neurotransmitters. They have three jobs. They bind, they activate, and they leave. So they don't actually get sucked in to this second neuron. So they bind to these receptor sites, they activate the receptor site, they give their message, and then they get dumped out. And they can either be reuptaken, so taken back into the original cell to be reused, or they can go over here and be broken down. Now you can kind of think of this as you're getting a telephone message. And so the presynaptic neuron up here is sending you the phone message. And it travels, they get the phone message over the phone, and the phone being the dendrites. So they get that message, and then they write down the message on a Post-it note, and then they run it down the hall, which is the axon. They run it down the hall, and then they hand you the Post-it. So the Post-it note is what they're giving you, that message. They give you the message. You read the message. and then you hand it back, and the messenger goes back to the telephones. So the same thing, those postsynaptic neurons do not keep the neurotransmitters. They drop them off and they hand them back. So that's how neurons work in general. Now, we take those individual neurons and we connect them together to create the nervous system. Now, we call it the nervous system, but really it can be broken down into a whole bunch of different systems within that nervous system. So the first way that we can break this down is the central versus the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. That's all the central nervous system is. The peripheral nervous system is everything else in your body. Those nerves that go to your fingertips, the ones that control your muscles, the ones that control your digestion, all of these different things. And so the peripheral nervous system can also be broken down even farther. And we're going to talk about each of these in turn a little bit more. So the central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is way more complex than that and can be broken down even farther into our somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system has your sensory inputs and your motor outputs. This is also referred to as your voluntary motor system because you get information coming in about where your limbs are, about if there's a rock under your foot, about things that you're touching, and then you send messages out to control your body, to move your leg or to move your arm. So that's all done by your somatic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is automatic. Everything that it does, it controls without us thinking about it. So our breathing, our heart rate, digestion, all of these things are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And it can be broken down even farther into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, you can't really see it here because for some reason the picture covered up the words, but the sympathetic nervous system uses energy. It is all about fight or flight. It helps you to move energy to those places that you need in order to survive for the next 5 minutes. So if a lion suddenly comes into the room, your sympathetic nervous system is going to be on alert. It's going to react. And what it's going to do is it's going to dilate your pupils. What that does is it opens up your eyes more. It lets you take in more light and therefore take in more information. It dilates your bronchial tubes. What that does is it makes it so that when you breathe in, you get more oxygen. It raises your heart rate. This makes it so that the blood can pump faster and harder and more efficiently to your legs, for instance, so that you can run away. It also shuts down non-essential processes. So what this means is it inhibits saliva production because digestion is not important when you're trying to survive a lion attack. And saliva is the main purpose of saliva is to help you start digesting your food. It inhibits the activity of the digestive organs. So your stomach and your intestines are going to shut down because who cares about digestion when there's a lion running after you? It also shuts down things like your reproductive system. And so because who cares about reproducing if you just need to survive for the next 5 minutes? So that's what your sympathetic nervous system is about. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is on high alert when you're stressed out. So when we stress ourselves out, now this can be psychological stress, such as being in college, or this can be physical stress, like running a mile or running away from a lion or doing a gymnastics routine. Your sympathetic nervous system is on board when all of that is happening, and it's helping you to move your energy to the most efficient processes and the most necessary processes. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is pretty much the exact opposite of that. Instead of using energy, the parasympathetic is all about conserving energy and maintenance. So, if the sympathetic nervous system shuts down digestion, the parasympathetic nervous system activates digestion. It helps you to store glucose in fat cells so that you can use that glucose later on when you're having to run from a lion later. It constricts your pupils so that you don't need to have too much light coming in. It reduces your heart rate. It decreases the amount of stress that you are putting on your heart on a regular basis. Because a lot of these things are peak physical skills we don't need on an everyday basis. It's much more important for our parasympathetic nervous system to increase the activity of digestion and of reproductive patterns and of your immune system. All of this is done by the parasympathetic nervous system. Whereas the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight. So if we're talking about the 4 F's, sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is feed and reproduce. So that's the peripheral nervous system. And now back to the central nervous system. Like I mentioned before, this consists of the brain and the spinal cord. However, we're able to do some movement just with the brain and spinal cord without having to use the peripheral nervous system. And the main one of these is a spinal reflex. Now, what happens with a spinal reflex is this is an automatic reflex that takes place just in the spinal cord. This is for things when you need to respond quickly. For instance, if you touch something that's really hot, your body needs to respond quickly. And so you have that signal coming into your arm, and then it goes into your spinal cord, and then it leaves your arm, it leaves your spinal cord, and the signal tells your arm to move away. Now, this is really important for you to respond quickly, because the faster you respond to something that's really hot, the less likely you are to get actual tissue damage from being burned. Usually, these spinal reflexes will respond immediately just in the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord will send a message up to the brain saying, hey, this is what happened. That's why if you've ever put your hand on a hot burner on the stove and pulled it away before you even realized that you were touching something hot. You may have also experienced this if you go to the doctor and they do that little hammer thing on your knee. That is your deep tendon reflex. Now, your deep tendon reflex is a spinal reflex, and what happens when they tap your knee like that is the tendon in your knee gets pressed, and that sends a signal to your spinal cord, and then your spinal cord says, oh no, something's happening, we have to respond by straightening out the leg. And that's why this deep tendon reflex happens without us thinking about it. Even when you're in a coma, you can have these spinal reflexes. People who are paralyzed do not have that kind. Before I start talking about the parts of the brain, I want to talk about one other system that's really important for behavior, and that's the endocrine system. Now, if you remember, the endocrine system is your system of glands that produce different hormones. Now, hormones are chemical messengers that are released into the bloodstream, and these are going to have very diffuse effects. So, hormones are very similar to neurotransmitters in that they both can have effects on neurons and both can have effects on the brain. But hormones are produced by glands. Neurotransmitters go from one neuron to the next. Hormones are produced by glands and are released into the bloodstream. Then they travel through the blood and then get into the brain and act on neurons. Now, what this means for hormones is that hormones are going to have much wider effects. They're going to have effects on the entire body, not just on one little part of the brain. And their action is going to be much slower. So when we're talking about neurotransmitters, this is on the order of milliseconds. But when we're looking at hormones, we're looking at the level of seconds to minutes. So you can have your fight or flight response. If you're stressed out, you can have your stress response by the sympathetic nervous system, and it's going to produce norepinephrine or epinephrine. You're also going to have a stress response in the form of a hormone response, producing adrenaline and cortisol. Now, because this is a much slower action, we're looking, cortisol takes about 20 minutes to show up after the time the stressor starts, and from the time that the stressor starts until we actually see the levels of cortisol in the brain, we're looking at about 20 minutes. So this is taking a while. Now, what this means is you can have what's called an endocrine hangover. This is where you're really stressed out, you have a moment of panic, and it takes you a while to calm down. So let's say you almost get into a car accident. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and you almost rear end them. Now, your sympathetic nervous system acts immediately. It is going to send that noradrenaline, that adrenaline, and it is going to it's going to send the oxygen to your muscles in your leg and tell you to stamp on the brake, and it's going to help you respond immediately. Your endocrine system is also going to activate. And for instance, you're going to continue feeling that adrenaline rush, that adrenaline rush, and you're going to continue feeling that cortisol. And that's why even long after you've started driving again, you didn't run into the person, you were able to keep going, you still kind of feel on edge. And that's because of this endocrine hangover, because it takes a little while for those hormones to kick in, because they have to go through your entire bloodstream. And so because of that, you keep feeling their effects long after the stressor is gone. Now, your adrenal glands are really important, like I said, for the stress response. And so this is where you're going to get your adrenaline. This is where you're also going to get cortisol. So your adrenal glands are down here on your kidneys. And another gland that is really important for psychology is the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is up here in the brain. So this is the front of the brain here. This is the back of the skull. Your pituitary gland is right here. So if you were to go straight up through the back of your mouth, that's basically where your pituitary gland is. And your pituitary gland is also referred to as the master gland because it has direct effects of its own. For instance, it produces growth hormone, so it's responsible for physical development. It also produces a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is really important for social bonding. We kind of use the term the love drug for oxytocin because when we give people nasal sprays of oxytocin, it actually makes them become friends with people faster. Pregnant mothers or nursing mothers produce oxytocin, and this helps them bond to their babies. But the pituitary gland also stimulates a number of other glands. The pituitary gland stimulates the adrenal glands. It can stimulate the pancreas. It can stimulate the thyroid and the parathyroid. It can stimulate the sex glands, the ovaries and the testes. So it has a lot of jobs throughout the body, and it can have direct effects of its own.